welcome back to another episode of the Master Presentations. I'm Simone Formisano, and today I'm here to tell you about my research project, titled Gamification of the Creative Process, Searching for Freedom Through Limitation. As a musician, I've always been fascinated by how rules and limitations, rather than restricting us, can actually spark creativity. The idea behind this research grew out of that curiosity. Its purpose is to investigate how game-like systems and rules can support and stimulate the creative process, with a focus on improvisation, composition, and performance. My main aim is not to give a final or exhaustive answer to complex questions, but rather to contribute to the field, documenting my own artistic journey. Here are my research questions. How can a set of rules or a game stimulate one's musical expression and be helpful to the creative process behind a music piece that features improvisation elements? And what are the benefits of these concepts in the creation of a performance? What are rules or game-like systems that other artists are using or have used in the past? How can a set of rules be applied to playfully interpret visuals? How can different games help in composition or performance? And finally, what games and or rules are helpful to me and my participants, and for what reasons? To answer these questions, I first look at the historical context. Jazz itself has always been a game with rules. From the bebop era onward, improvisers relied on structures like chord progressions, licks, and especially tradings as a way of creating musical dialogue. Trading is the practice of exchanging bars between soloist and drummer, usually 4 or 8. Like a game, trading is structured around rules. Musicians take turn improvising within a fixed number of measures, while adhering to the underlying harmonic framework and tempo. These constraints create the boundaries of the game board. Trading can be compared to a game of conversation or even a sporting match. Each soloist presents a musical idea, which is then answered, developed, or challenged by the next player. And just as in a game of tennis, the back and forth exchange creates momentum and excitement, keeping both performers and listeners engaged. In summary, jazz musicians have historically relied on rules or game-like systems such as improvisation over fixed forms, trading, and structured call and response exchanges to shape their music expressively. Later, other systems emerge, such as the sound painting. Sound painting is a gestural language for collective improvisation. This language was created by Walter Thompson in 1974 and currently comprises more than 1,500 gestures. A typical sound painting performance is led by the sound painter, which in this case serves as a real-time composer, who stands in front of the group and communicates a series of signs with hand and body gestures, indicating what the group of musicians is to perform. The sound painter then develops the participants' responses, shaping it and molding them within the composition. Here is a clip from a sound painting performance conducted by Walter Thompson himself. Similarly to games, sound painting operates within a defined set of rules and structures. Its gestures function as moves that guide performers' actions, just like how players follow game rules. Sound painting incorporates elements of chance and unpredictability, as the sound painter cannot anticipate the exact responses of the performers, paralleling the role of randomness in many games. Furthermore, both sound painting and games encourage creativity and problem solving within constraints, fostering an environment where participants can experiment and innovate. If we go further back in music history, we can see that even Mozart experimented with games. His so-called musical dice game, or in its German title that I will not attempt to pronounce now, was a system for composing minuets through the throw of dice. He prepared a large set of short, pre-composed musical measures, and the sequence of these fragments in the minuet was determined by the roll of two dice, through the direct correspondence between each fragment and a specific number, ranging from 2 to 12. Mozart's musical dice game illustrates how randomness, framed by strict constraints, can operate as a compositional device. It shows that game-like processes, long before jazz improvisation or sound painting, were already being used as both playful and practical tools for musical invention. So, clearly, musicians across history have used games and rules to balance structure and freedom. What I found missing in the literature, though, was an exploration of how individual musicians today invent their own systems as part of their personal artistic development. That became the focus of my methodology. The methodology I adopted to carry out this research was practice-based. It involved conducting interviews, experimentation, documentation, and some retrospective reflection. I started by reflecting on the role of trading in my own artistic growth. Then I interviewed other musicians, from whom I learned about a game based on turning everyday objects into sound and about an application called Life. This program transforms sounds into rhythms through the use of artificial intelligence. I tested these games, adapting them with some personal twists. Finally, I developed my own systems, which I called the angle game and the dice game. As a variation on these games, I also tried composition experiments based on the interpretation of pictures without strict rules. All of these experiments were performed, recorded, and critically reflected upon. By conducting interviews with other artists, the main purpose was to ask them if they use or have ever used games or game-like sets of rules in their music-making process or in their practice routines. I asked them if these methods have stimulated them to think about sound in a different way and whether they were beneficial to their general creative expression. In interviewing Nadine Nix, she told me that music is a game for her too, and that her approach to it and her main focus is to follow the sound. On stage, she lets the sound guide her and gives inputs to her musicians, often steering the performance towards different directions based on their responses and interplay. The second interview I conducted was with drummer Ron Van Straten. He told me how one of his conservatory teachers used to subject his students to an interesting game. The teacher would tell them to look at something and work with their imagination to create the sound that it would make. According to him, playing this game was a way of stimulating him to think differently than usual. After concluding these interviews, the next step in this research project was to test the games collected so far. In the next section, I'm going to explain the rules and show you an example for every tested game. The first game I tested was based on the concept of playing the objects emerged from the interview with Ron. I decided to give a personal twist to it. The goal was not to just play the sounds that the object could make, but to create a groove inspired by it, by observing it and trying to gather as much information as possible. To conduct this experiment, I asked someone to bring me several household objects. The clip I'm about to show you is about one of these experiments. In this case, the object was a Moka-type coffee machine, an item that can be found in basically every Italian household. In the creation of the groove, I drew inspiration from the machine's components, its functionalities and its uses. Now I'm going to let the video do the talking. The second game-like method that I tested was experimenting with beats processed through the Life app by XLN Audio and produce short bits of music inspired by them. This program can turn everyday sounds into loops and rhythms. It analyzes the source recording, splices it into separate samples, and then combines them to create a selection of rhythms which are modifiable at will. To let you have an overview of its basic functionalities, here's a short clip from the official presentation by XLN Audio.
Introducing Life by XLN Audio. Step away from overused loops and sample packs and generate infinite beats with the unique sounds from your life. Capture moments anywhere, anytime with Life's Field Recorder app, or import your favorite moments from your camera roll. Drag and drop audio or video straight onto Life, or capture anything in your DAW with Life's DAW Recorder. Meet your new Happy Accidents machine. Every generated beat is endlessly tweakable with Life's AI-powered variation controls.
To produce the music pieces, I started from this voicemail I once received from a friend. I uploaded this voicemail in Live as a source file and then selected one of the AI-generated beats based on that. Using this loop as the starting point, I slightly modified it and then wrote in this order a complementary drum part, a bass line, and a short theme. Afterwards, I added a separate section with a different chord progression and invited the guitarist to join a recording session where he could improvise while playing along with the track. Here's the video documentation of that session. The first game I developed myself is about how to translate an image into a rhythm by following a few guidelines traced on the image itself. The goal of this game is to obtain a groove that will be used as the starting point in a session of collective improvisation with an ensemble of musicians. To understand how the rules of this game function, here's a visual step-by-step explanation. What I call the angle game was developed with the purpose of translating a visual input into music, specifically a rhythm pattern. With this idea on my mind, I designed a few ground rules that I'm going to explain now with a step-by-step example. First, we're going to choose a picture that will be used as source material for the translation process. It can be a photograph, a painting, or any other kind of visual element. In this case, I chose a photograph I took in Amsterdam. Then we're going to identify a silhouette, in this case the contour line of the building, and simplify it into a series of segments and angles. The third step consists of assigning a note to each angle. The duration of every note is defined by the length of its following segment. In other words, by the free interpretation of the distance between angles. If we transfer this series of notes on a music staff, we're going to obtain a rhythm pattern like the one shown here. In this case, given the quantity and length of the notes, I decided to adapt this pattern over 2, 3, 4 tempo bars. Now, in this experiment, I orchestrated this series of notes between bass drum and snare drum in order to translate the original picture into a groove that could serve as the starting point of a collective improvisation session. To do so, I adopted a simple rule. The notes related to every angle smaller than 180 degrees would correspond to a bass drum, while the angles wider than that would translate into a snare drum instead. The groove obtained at the end of this translation process is graphically represented here, with the addition of 16th notes on the hi-hat. Here's how it sounds with the help of a sequencer. In the testing process of this game, I held a series of rehearsals with progressively larger ensembles. I started with a duo lineup with drums and piano, then extended it into a quartet, and finally played the performance in quintet included in my final concerts program. Here is some video footage from that concert. This performance was built around the concept of starting from the beat resulted by the interpretation of the picture, and then going in other musical directions through interplay, the musicians' responses, and their subjective interpretation of the same image.
I'm Mr. King Dice. I'm the gamest in the land.
While games like the groovification of objects and the angle game exploit a musician's propensity to subjectively interpret inputs such as items and geometric figures, what I named the dice game was conceived with a different question in mind. What if the information to be interpreted is provided by a factor of absolute randomness? To experiment with this, I wanted to try out a method for creating rhythms using a simple mechanism, which at the same time represents the ultimate icon of board games, the throw of a die. In devising this system, I implemented a few simple rules that I'm going to illustrate in the next clip. The first things we need to establish are time signature, subdivision grid, and the number of bars that the desired rhythm will occupy. Each side of the die we use is going to represent a quantity of the established subdivision units. For example, if we choose a 16th note subdivision, the number 1 on the die will represent 1 16th note, the second 2 16th notes, and so on. We're going to roll the die a sufficient number of times so that the total result can equal or exceed the number of subdivision units in the pre-established bars. Then we're going to interpret the result of each throw as notes and rests alternately. At last, we're going to transcribe this succession of notes and rests on a musical staff. Here's a practical one-bar example of the application of these rules. In this case, I chose a 16th note subdivision, I rolled the 6-sided die 7 times, and I transcribed the results as notes and rests alternately. The result of each roll is written below the rhythm pattern and shows a direct correspondence with the related notes or rests. Here's how this example sounds. To expand the possibilities of the dice game, I tried to apply its rules to compose several melodic parts of a piece. To better understand how these rules work and how they can be used in the realization of a melody, let's take a look at the step-by-step creative process behind the original composition I Failed Maths. First, I rolled an 8-sided die 20 times. The results were interpreted alternately as notes and rests on a 16th note grid and were sufficient to fill 4 bars with a 4/4 time signature. The resulting series of notes and rests is shown here. Using the rhythm of these 4 bars, I freely assigned notes from the A natural minor scale. The melody obtained through this interpretation was eventually used in the A section of I Failed Maths. To compose the B section of the same piece, I decided to use an alternate application of these rules. I rolled the D8 12 times and interpreted the results as single notes whose length was dictated by the related result. Here is the graphic outcome of this alternate interpretation. To harmonize and arrange these melodies, I teamed up with pianist Oliver Cervera. Let's take a look at the score and listen to the A and B section of I Failed Maths. As a variation on the games, I tried to compose music pieces based solely on the interpretation of a picture. In this process, the only rule was to draw as much information as possible from a single image. In the composition that I'm about to show you, called Little Penguins, I used as source material a photograph of 2 penguins in their natural habitat. I pictured the fictional story of a day in their normal life, drawing inspiration from some of their typical behavioral traits. In harmonizing and arranging this composition, I collaborated again with pianist Oliver Cervera. Follow the score and the visual indications to see what inspired me in the creation of this piece. The experiments carried out in this research project show that incorporating games and rule-based systems into a creative process can be both stimulating and constraining, depending on the form and the degree of the freedom in the rules. The games created a framework that encouraged me to explore musical ideas I might not have encountered otherwise. At the same time, the act of playing by the rules occasionally risked narrowing my options, producing results that felt more mechanical than expressive. When comparing the different games, their outcomes displayed distinctive musical characters and revealed also a few common elements. What unites them is the presence of constraints that guide creativity, whether through pre-existing musical structures, external stimuli, or randomness. All games demanded an active process of interpretation and decision-making, forcing me to interact with the material in a way that was both responsive and inventive. On the other hand, the differences between games were just as significant. The Gamification of Objects game felt highly stimulating as it encouraged me to approach rhythm from a new angle, translating everyday items into grooves. Yet, its outcomes were often short-lived, producing grooves that worked well as sketches but did not always develop into fully realized pieces. Life brought in an entirely different perspective. Unlike the human-centered games, life operated as a mirror of my environment, turning raw sounds into immediate rhythmic inspiration. Working with machine-generated input was a powerful trigger for new rhythmic ideas, but the challenge laid in the risk of relying too much on the machine's output. The Angle game had perhaps the strongest balance between rules and freedom. It transformed a visual input into a rhythmic pattern that could grow into collective improvisation, generating results that felt unique and deeply personal. In ensemble contexts, this translated into improvisations that balanced between freedom and the geometric constraints of the image. At the same time, some sessions showed how too much focus on improvisation could become limiting, blurring the line between exploratory play and a coherent artistic product, as extended interplay risked diluting the clarity of the initial image-based material. The dice game, with its emphasis on randomness, produced surprising results, though at times lacking immediate musical identity. Its strength lay less in producing cohesive material and more in challenging me to look for artistic value from arbitrary results. It could produce lines that were unplayable and fragmented, but sometimes offered surprising rhythmic solutions. By reflecting on the results of each experiment, I can now critically assess how far the findings answer my research questions, so let's take a look at them again. How can a set of rules or a game stimulate one's musical expression and be helpful to the creative process behind a music piece that features improvisation elements? And what are the benefits of these concepts in the creation of a performance? The games tested throughout this project showed that rules can act as creative triggers, stimulating musical ideas that might not emerge spontaneously, while the dice game and the AI-based experiments stimulated problem solving and creative adaptation skills. However, rules can sometimes feel restrictive. The most successful outcomes emerge when the rules served as guidelines rather than strict limitations, allowing space for flexibility and personal expression. What are rules or game-like systems that other artists are using or have used in the past? The literature review and interviews highlighted several historical and contemporary systems. Tradings exemplify a traditional jazz game formalized during the bebop era and still widely used. Sound painting, as codified by Walter Thompson, represents a gesture-based collective improvisation system with strong parallels to game structures. Beyond jazz, even Mozart's musical dice game reveals a precedent for randomness-based composition. Interviews further showed that artists do apply unconventional systems, for example, object-based games and AI tools like Life. How can a set of rules be applied to playfully interpret visuals? The angle game and picture-based composition experiments showed that visual inputs can be powerful creative catalysts. By translating a contour line into rhythmic structures or by interpreting the atmosphere of a photograph through sound, these exercises expanded the palette of musical ideas and created connections between art forms. In performance contexts, the angle game encouraged collective improvisation as ensemble members could interpret the same visual stimulus differently, producing unexpected layers of interaction, while picture-based composing proved more valuable in reaching artistic coherence through a narrative interpretation. How can different games help with the composition of a piece and or in the realization of a performance? The games had different impacts on composition and performance. The dice game and AI-based live plugin were especially effective as brainstorming tools, generating rhythm material that could be developed further. However, their randomness sometimes produced incoherent results, making them less effective for shaping fully developed performance. By contrast, the angle game proved the balance between structure and freedom, resulting in grooves and collective improvisation that felt musically strong and performable. Overall, games proved more effective for stimulating performance interaction than for producing coherent compositional structures, unless of course adapted with a certain flexibility. What games and/or rules are helpful to me and my participants, and for what reasons? From a personal perspective, the angle game resonated the most with my artistic identity, offering a method that combined rhythmic exploration with visual inspiration. The groovification of objects provided short-term inspiration but often lacked depth for long-term development. AI-based life and the dice game were helpful as creative provocations but less satisfying as performance tools. Overall, these findings suggest that the most useful rules are those that balance constraints with interpretative freedom, aligning with my intuitive processes while also challenging me to step outside habitual patterns. While the research questions were addressed, the methodology's limitations must be acknowledged. The practice-based approach offered valuable first-hand insights, but made the results highly subjective, dependent on my instrument, collaborators, and personal aesthetics. Moreover, the sample of games tested remains necessarily selective, leaving unexplored the full range of possible systems. Nevertheless, the project demonstrated that rules and games can meaningfully stimulate creativity, particularly when treated as open-ended tools rather than rigid systems. The findings highlight the importance of balance. Too much freedom can lead to aimless results, while too much constraint can be overwhelming. By navigating this tension, I was able to incorporate games into my creative process in ways that enriched both composition and performance, while also revealing the boundaries of such approaches. At the beginning of this research project, one of the goals that I set for myself was to bring closer together the two meanings of the verb to play, as in to play music and to play games. After carrying out this research, I can say that, at least in my personal artistic journey, I succeeded in taking a considerable amount of steps in that direction.